Miss Marple and the Portrait with No Face. Chapter 1. A Picture in the Parish Hall. The village of Marleycombe had an air of timeless quiet about it, as though the world beyond its hedgerows and winding lanes were little more than a distant rumour. The church spire rose above a scatter of tiled roofs, sheep grazed in fields where mist clung to the grass, and the high street boasted a handful of shops that seemed never to change. A greengrocer's with baskets spilling over with apples, the post office with its worn brass scales, and the tea shop where Mrs. Dalloway presided with formidable cheer. It was the sort of place where people noticed everything. Who had bought a new hat, who had missed morning service, who had walked home late with whom. Gossip here was less a pastime than a kind of glue, binding the village together in a web of curiosity and speculation. That was why the new painting in the parish hall stirred such interest. It had been donated by Colonel Travers, a retired army man who had taken up residence on the edge of the village after years abroad. The picture was large, somber, and oddly unsettling, a portrait in dark oils of a figure in period dress. But the face, the very center of the canvas, had been left blank, as though the artist had abandoned his work before the final strokes. The villagers gathered to see it on the evening it was unveiled, clustered in their best coats beneath the oak beams of the hall. There were murmurs of approval, frowns of puzzlement, and, inevitably, whispers. "It gives me the shivers," said Mrs. Price, the butcher's wife, drawing her shawl more tightly around her shoulders. "Why ever would anyone hang such a thing?" "Modern art, my dear," replied Mr. Ellison, the schoolmaster, with a faintly superior air. "One mustn't expect to understand it." Miss Marple, who had come with her friend Mrs. Bantry, sat quietly near the back. Her blue eyes, clear as ever despite her years, rested on the canvas with a thoughtful gaze. She did not frown or start, she simply looked. One might have thought she was knitting without needles, weaving together threads invisible to others. The vicar, a well-meaning man with a tendency to ramble, made a little speech thanking Colonel Travers for his generous gift. There was polite applause. Afterwards, the villagers lingered, some drinking weak tea from enamel cups, others continuing to eye the portrait as though it might shift when they weren't looking. It was then that Mrs. Bantry leaned toward Miss Marple. "My dear Jane," she murmured, "doesn't it seem odd? To present a painting like that, with the face missing." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Odd, perhaps. But then life so often is. I wonder." Her words trailed off as Colonel Travers himself entered. A tall, angular man with a clipped mustache, he looked pleased by the attention his donation had stirred. Yet, if one watched closely, there was a tightness about his eyes, a flicker that suggested the picture meant more to him than he cared to admit. That night, the talk of Marleycombe was of nothing but the strange portrait. Some declared it ugly, others insisted it must be valuable. A few wondered if the missing face had some symbolic meaning. But by the following morning, the village would have a far more urgent matter to discuss, for the peace of Marleycombe was about to be shattered. Miss Marple and the Portrait with No Face. Chapter 2. A Shocking Discovery. The morning after the unveiling of the portrait dawned cool and clear, with a light mist clinging stubbornly to the hedgerows. Marleycombe looked its usual peaceful self, milk delivered on doorsteps, dogs barking at the postman, the faint ring of the church bell calling a handful of early worshippers to matins. On the surface, nothing suggested that the village's calm routine was about to be violently broken. But in small villages, it is often those quiet mornings that bring the greatest upheavals. It was young Tommy Briggs, the verger's son, who first noticed something unusual. Sent by his mother to fetch hymnals left behind after the evening gathering, he unlocked the heavy door of the parish hall. The smell hit him at once, not the faint, musty odor of wood polish and dust he was accustomed to, but something heavier, metallic, unpleasant. He wrinkled his nose, hesitated, and then stepped inside. The hall was in semi-darkness, the tall windows clouded with condensation. Chairs still stood in neat rows from the night before, and at the far end of the hall, beneath the newly hung portrait, lay the body of a man. Tommy froze. The figure was sprawled unnaturally on the wooden floor, one arm flung out, his head tilted at an angle no living man could have held. His eyes were open, fixed on nothing, and his shirt front was stained with blood. The faceless portrait loomed above him, its blank oval of paint seeming to gaze down upon the scene with eerie detachment. Tommy dropped the hymnals and ran. Within half an hour, Marleycombe was alive with alarm. The news spread with astonishing speed. Mrs. Briggs had rushed to the grocer's, Mr. Ellison had hurried to the post office, and by the time the vicar himself arrived at the hall, a knot of villagers had already gathered outside, buzzing with speculation. Who is it? Do they know? Was it an accident? No, it must be murder. The body, as it was quickly established, belonged to Mr. Arthur Sims, a middle-aged clerk from the solicitor's office in the next town. He was not a man of great consequence, but he had been seen at the unveiling the night before, sitting toward the middle of the hall. Nobody could quite recall him leaving. Colonel Travers, summoned from his breakfast, looked genuinely shaken. His angular face had grown pale, and his hand trembled slightly as he adjusted his tie. "Good heavens," he muttered. "In my hall, beneath that painting, this is dreadful business." The vicar, flustered and anxious, tried to maintain order. "Please everyone step back. The police will be here shortly. There's nothing more to be done until they arrive." Yet order was not so easily restored. The villagers were already whispering. It must be robbery. No, nothing was taken, they say. Then it was personal. Had enemies, perhaps. Arthur Sims? He was a dull man. Who could possibly hate him enough to kill? Miss Marple, walking with her neat little step from Mrs. Bantry's house where she had taken tea that morning, arrived just as Inspector Craythorne's motor car pulled up outside the hall. She stood unobtrusively among the cluster of onlookers, her eyes watchful, her expression mild. Where others gaped and speculated, she simply observed. She noticed the odd way Colonel Travers pressed his lips together whenever the portrait was mentioned. She noticed Mrs. Price crossing herself, not from religious fervor, but from genuine fear. She noticed the vicar's wife clutching her husband's sleeve a little too tightly, as though afraid of something more than just the horror of death. It was not, Miss Marple reflected, the corpse itself that so disturbed the villagers. It was the portrait looming above, with its faceless figure staring down at them all, as though the painting itself were somehow bound to the crime. Inspector Craythorne was a man of solid build and no-nonsense manner, already familiar to Marleycombe from previous minor investigations. He strode into the hall, examined the scene, and soon re-emerged to announce briskly, "This is a matter for Scotland Yard if it proves too complicated, but for now it is my case. No one is to leave the village until further notice." The crowd murmured, half thrilled, half anxious. "Now then," continued the inspector, "this man, Arthur Sims, clerk to Mr. Devunum the solicitor, was last seen here last night. He was stabbed, single wound, clean thrust. The weapon has not been recovered. That means it may well still be in the village. And I'll be speaking to every one of you." He did not, of course, notice the small, neat figure of Miss Marple at the edge of the crowd. But Miss Marple noticed him, and more importantly, she noticed the slight ripple of unease that passed through the villagers as he spoke. Not fear of the inspector, but fear of what might be uncovered. She turned her eyes once more upon the blank-faced portrait. A thought stirred at the back of her mind, something she could not yet put into words. But she felt, quite certainly, that the faceless figure would prove central to the truth of this crime. And as the church bells tolled midday across the quiet fields, Marleycombe's ordinary peace was gone. Something darker had settled in its place. Miss Marple and the portrait with no face. Chapter 3. The Village in Uproar. By midday, Marleycombe was buzzing like a disturbed hive. The murder of Arthur Sims, in their very own parish hall, beneath that unnerving faceless portrait, had unsettled the village in a way no outside event ever could. Marleycombe prided itself on being a peaceful, orderly place, a world apart from the violence one read about in the London papers. For such a thing to happen here felt like a crack in reality itself. Mrs. Dalloway's tea shop, usually filled with polite chatter about recipes and flowers, was now host to a gathering of anxious, whispering voices. Every table was taken, cups of tea untouched as their owners leaned in with gleaming eyes. "I said it the moment I saw that painting," declared Mrs. Price, her ample frame leaning over the sugar bowl. "It's a bad omen. A picture without a face? It's practically inviting misfortune." "Superstitious nonsense," retorted Mr. Ellison, the schoolmaster, though his hands trembled slightly as he stirred his tea. The crime was committed by a person, not a picture. Sims must have had enemies. Enemies? Mrs. Price scoffed. Arthur Sims was duller than boiled cabbage. No one cared enough about him to make an enemy. At another table, young Emily Carter whispered to her friend, "I heard the knife's still missing. Imagine, somewhere in the village, hidden away." She gave a little shiver of theatrical delight. Her friend clasped her hands. "Do you think the killer is one of us? Someone's sitting here right now." Several heads turned at that, and for a moment the whole shop seemed to fall into uneasy silence. The thought had crossed every mind. The murderer was not some stranger who had crept in under cover of darkness. He was here among them. Meanwhile, outside the tea shop, the vicar's wife, Mrs. Weatherby, clutched her husband's arm as they walked quickly down the high street. "Harold," she said in a hushed, urgent tone, "this is dreadful. People will say the church is cursed. First that portrait, now this." "Nonsense, my dear," replied the vicar, though his face was pale. "We must put our trust in Inspector Craythorne. He will find the culprit." But Mrs. Weatherby was not reassured. She had grown up in Marleycombe, and she knew how quickly whispers became judgments, and judgments became lifelong scars. Miss Marple, seated in her usual quiet corner of the tea shop with her knitting bag by her side, listened without appearing to. Her needles clicked softly as she worked a line of pale blue wool, but her eyes occasionally lifted to study the room. She noticed how Mrs. Price spoke too loudly, as though to convince herself as much as the others. She noticed Mr. Ellison's unease, his hand shaking ever so slightly, though he claimed disdain for superstitious nonsense. She noticed Emily Carter's morbid excitement, the way young people sometimes thrilled at danger without understanding its true weight. And most of all, she noticed the shadow that seemed to pass over the villagers whenever Colonel Travers's name was mentioned. It was not quite fear nor dislike, but something more complicated. A sense of unease, as though his presence in the village, with his strange portrait and mysterious past, had brought a darkness with it. By late afternoon, Marleycombe's gossip network had reached fever pitch. Mrs. Briggs, the verger's wife, declared she had heard footsteps in the hall the night before, though she admitted she might have been half asleep. Mr. Hargreaves, the blacksmith, claimed to have seen Arthur Sims speaking in low tones to Colonel Travers during the interval at the unveiling, though no one else recalled it. And Mrs. Dalloway, who missed nothing, confided to anyone who would listen that she was certain, absolutely certain, the portrait was somehow connected to the crime. The inspector, meanwhile, conducted his official questioning with gruff efficiency, but the more he asked, the more confused the picture became. Too many people had been present. Too many conflicting memories of who had left when, or with whom. That evening, Miss Marple walked slowly back along the lane to Mrs. Bantry's cottage, where she was staying for a few days. The air was cool, scented faintly with wood smoke, and the sky was streaked with the pinks and golds of a fading sunset. "You've been very quiet today, Jane," Mrs. Bantry remarked as they entered the sitting room. "Yes, my dear," Miss Marple replied softly, setting aside her knitting. "But quietness can be most instructive. People often tell you more when they think you're not paying attention." Mrs. Bantry gave her a sharp look. "You mean you've noticed something?" Miss Marple smiled, that faint, almost apologetic smile of hers. "Oh, nothing conclusive. But human nature, you know, is much the same everywhere. People try to hide their little secrets, but they have a way of peeping out when one least expects." Her gaze, thoughtful and sharp, drifted toward the window, where the last light was fading over the fields. Somewhere in the village, she felt sure, the truth of Arthur Sims's death lay hidden, tangled up with that blank, faceless portrait. And in time it would reveal itself. Miss Marple and the portrait with no face. Chapter 4. The Police Arrive. Inspector Craythorne was a man of firm tread and brisk manner, the sort of policeman who gave the impression that any problem, no matter how thorny, could be resolved by method and discipline. He had been called to Marleycombe once before, a burglary at the grocer's some years back, and his handling of the matter had impressed the villagers, who liked authority to look both solid and reliable. But murder was another matter. When Craythorne arrived at the parish hall on that grim morning, his broad shoulders filled the doorway, his notebook already in hand. He barked orders for the hall to be cleared of onlookers, then set constables to guard the entrance. Inside, he bent over the body of Arthur Sims with a grim frown, his mustache bristling as though in indignation at such wickedness in a quiet English village. By the time he emerged, a hush had fallen over the gathered crowd. He wasted no words. "This is murder," he announced, his voice cutting through the silence. Mr. Arthur Sims, clerk at Mr. Davenum's firm, was stabbed sometime between 9 o'clock last night and midnight. The wound was clean, inflicted with a sharp blade. The weapon is not here. That means the killer left with it. Gasps rippled through the villagers. A missing weapon. It was the sort of detail that turned speculation into fear. "I shall require statements from everyone who attended last night's unveiling," Craythorne continued briskly. "No one is to leave Marleycombe until this matter is resolved." Colonel Travers, who had been pacing like a caged lion at the edge of the crowd, now stepped forward. His tall frame was rigid, his face drawn. "Inspector, this is appalling, in my hall of all places. And beneath that portrait." "Yes, Colonel," Craythorne replied evenly. "I'd like a word with you first, if you please." The two men withdrew to the vicar's study, which the inspector had requisitioned as temporary headquarters. Miss Marple, standing at the fringe of the crowd with her gentle, unobtrusive presence, noticed how the colonel's hands trembled slightly as he lit a cigarette before following. He did not look like a man confident of answering questions. In the vicar's study, Craythorne opened his notebook. "Colonel Travers, you presented the painting last night. Tell me, where did it come from?" The colonel exhaled smoke in a long, thin stream. "It was a purchase from an estate sale in Devon, Inspector. A rather curious piece. I thought it might suit the parish hall." "Curious indeed," said Craythorne dryly. "Why is the face missing?" The colonel shifted. "The artist never completed it. At least, that was the story given. Yet you thought it worth hanging in the village hall?" The colonel stiffened. "It was a donation. A gift to the community. Surely we needn't waste time on artistic matters when a man has been murdered." Craythorne eyed him shrewdly. "Sometimes, Colonel, what seems irrelevant turns out to be central." Outside, the villagers buzzed with speculation about what was happening behind the closed door. Mrs. Price whispered that Travers had looked positively green. Mr. Ellison muttered that army men always carried secrets. Mrs. Dalloway, enjoying her position as purveyor of tea to the constables, declared with relish that she wouldn't be surprised if the portrait was cursed. Miss Marple, seated quietly on a bench beneath the yew tree, said nothing. She was remembering something, the way Arthur Sims had sat alone the night before, glancing repeatedly and uneasily toward the colonel. Few had noticed, but she had. When Colonel Travers at last emerged, his jaw was tight, his expression set. He brushed past the villagers without a word, striding away down the lane toward his house. Craythorne followed soon after, speaking briefly with his constables before turning to address the villagers once more. "Mr. Sims's movements yesterday are being traced. If any of you spoke with him after the unveiling, now is the time to say so." There was hesitation, a shuffle of feet. Then Mr. Hargreaves, the blacksmith, raised his voice. "I saw him speaking with the colonel, low voices, serious-like. But when I passed by, they stopped talking sudden." All eyes swung toward the lane where Travers had vanished. "Thank you," said Craythorne, jotting it down. "That will be looked into." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid a call to Mrs. Bantry. They sat together in the cozy sitting room, the fire crackling, while the distant sound of gossip floated in from the lane. "My dear Jane," said Mrs. Bantry, lowering her voice, "do you think it could have been Travers? He looked so guilty." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she knitted. "Appearances can be deceiving, Dolly. People often look guilty when they are merely frightened. And sometimes the truly guilty look quite calm." "You mean you don't think it was him?" Miss Marple gave a faint smile. "I mean only that I should like to know what Mr. Sims was doing in Marleycombe at all. He was not a villager, you see, and people rarely come to such gatherings without some reason." Mrs. Bantry shivered. "Oh, Jane, you always notice the little things. Do you think you'll solve it before the inspector?" "My dear," said Miss Marple gently, "I have no ambition to solve anything, but I have observed a good many human beings in my time, and human nature, alas, is much the same whether in a quiet village or a busy city." She bent again to her knitting, but her eyes were far away, thoughtful. Already, tiny threads of suspicion were weaving together in her mind. And somewhere in Marleycombe she felt certain the killer was watching, listening, wondering how long their secret could be kept. Miss Marple and the Portrait with No Face. Chapter 5. Whispers in the Tea Shop. By the next morning, Marleycombe was humming like a hive. The inspector had spent the evening interviewing villagers one by one, his questions brisk, his pencil scratching across his notebook. No arrests had been made, and that fact alone left the village restless. When no culprit is swiftly caught, imaginations leap into the void. And so, as always, the center of speculation was Mrs. Dalloway's tea shop. By 10 o'clock, it was crowded with neighbors who had no particular need for tea and scones but every need for the latest morsel of news. The chintz-curtained windows steamed over with breath and teapots hissed as gossip flowed thicker than cream. "I'll tell you plain," Mrs. Price announced loudly, as though giving testimony in court. "It was Colonel Travers. Everyone knows he argued with that poor man Sims last night." "You think you heard," corrected Mr. Ellison, the schoolmaster, adjusting his spectacles. "No one actually heard the words. You can't convict a man for looking serious." "Well, if looks could kill," muttered Mrs. Briggs, provoking a ripple of nervous laughter. At the corner table, young Emily Carter leaned close to her friend. "My aunt says the Colonel brought that portrait back from abroad. Something to do with a family scandal. Imagine. What if the faceless person was meant to be one of them?" Her friend's eyes widened. "And Sims knew about it?" Emily nodded sagely, enjoying the effect of her words. "That's what Auntie thinks. Sims was a clerk after all. Clerks see all sorts of secrets." Miss Marple sat unobtrusively near the fireplace, her knitting needles clicking softly. She looked for all the world like a harmless old lady keeping her hands busy while others talked. But behind her mild eyes she was listening carefully, not so much to what was said but to how. She noticed how Mrs. Price's voice rose stridently whenever she condemned Travers, betraying more eagerness than certainty. She noticed how Emily's delight in her own tale seemed greater than any genuine fear. And she noticed the silence of Mrs. Weatherby, the vicar's wife, who sat pale and tight-lipped, contributing nothing at all. Silence, Miss Marple reflected, could sometimes say more than words. At 11, the tea shop's door swung open with a jangle, and Inspector Craythorne himself stepped in. His solid frame seemed to fill the room, and the babble of conversation died at once. Mrs. Dalloway bustled forward to offer him a pot of tea on the house, but he declined with a curt shake of his head. "I've a statement to make," he said, his voice carrying. "Until further notice, the parish hall is closed to the public. The painting will remain under guard. And I'll remind you all that spreading rumors can be as harmful as lies. If any of you have genuine information, you'd do better to bring it to me than chatter over teacups." There was a ripple of embarrassment, and a few mutters. But after the inspector had gone, the whispers resumed, quieter now but tinged with defiance. Marleycombe would not be silenced so easily. When the crowd thinned at last, Miss Marple rose and made her way to the counter to settle her bill. Mrs. Dalloway leaned across and lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Between ourselves, Miss Marple, I've never trusted that Colonel. Always so stiff and secretive. And that picture, staring down without a face. It's enough to give one nightmares. I'd not be surprised if it was all connected." Miss Marple gave her a gentle smile. "I dare say you may be right, Mrs. Dalloway. Though, of course, not always in the way we first suppose." She left the tea shop, walking slowly along the lane, her knitting tucked neatly under her arm. She was turning over something in her mind, a small detail easily overlooked but significant in its way. Arthur Sims had no family in Marleycombe. No business either, as far as anyone knew. And yet he had attended the unveiling of that portrait. Why? People rarely turned up where they were not wanted. And clerks, as Emily Carter had so gaily remarked, did indeed have access to secrets. Miss Marple paused by the churchyard gate, looking back toward the shuttered parish hall where the faceless portrait now hung in guarded silence. She had the curious sensation that the picture, for all its emptiness, was watching. And she knew, though she could not yet say why, that the whispers in Mrs. Dalloway's tea shop had contained the first faint glimmer of truth. Miss Marple and the Portrait with No Face. Chapter 6. Colonel Travers under question. The inspector did not waste time. By mid-afternoon he had summoned Colonel Travers to his study in the vicarage, a room now littered with notes, maps, and the constable's reports. The curtains were half drawn against the afternoon sun, and the air inside was heavy with the smell of pipe smoke. Colonel Travers entered briskly, his boots clicking against the tiles, but there was a stiffness about him, as though he were preparing for battle. His mustache bristled, his chin was set, yet his eyes flickered uneasily when they met the inspector's. "Colonel," said Craythorne without preamble, "you were one of the last to be seen speaking with Mr. Arthur Sims before his death. What was the subject of your conversation?" Travers shifted in his chair. It was of no consequence. A passing remark about the picture. The inspector leaned forward. "Be precise, if you please." "Well," Travers said after a pause, "Sims asked where I had found the painting. I told him. And estate sale in Devon. He seemed interested. That is all." "Interested how?" The colonel exhaled, tapping ash from his cigarette. "Oh, in that way clerks often are. He liked facts, provenance, details. I had none to give him. Frankly, I grew impatient. I told him it was merely a picture, and none of his affair." Craythorne studied him closely. "And yet you donated it to the parish hall. Rather a strange choice, don't you think? Most benefactors give brass plaques or hymn books. Not a gloomy portrait with no face." Travers bristled. "I thought it had character. Besides, art is a matter of taste. You cannot expect me to justify aesthetics to the police." The inspector's tone hardened. "This is not about aesthetics, Colonel. It's about motive. A man is dead. And if you expect me to believe he took such interest in a painting for no reason at all, you are gravely mistaken." For a moment, silence hung heavy. Then Travers stood, his back ramrod straight. "I will answer your questions, Inspector, but I'll not sit here to be insulted. I served my country for 30 years. My conscience is clear. If you require further information, you may consult my solicitor." And with that, he strode from the room. Word of the exchange spread quickly, carried on Marleycomb's invisible network of whispers. By supper time, the whole village knew the colonel had clashed with the inspector, and speculation grew wilder with every retelling. Some said Travers had confessed outright. Others insisted the police had found the murder weapon hidden in his home. Truth mattered less than the thrill of scandal. At Mrs. Bantry's cottage, Miss Marple sat with her hostess over a light supper. The windows stood open to the cool evening air, and the murmur of distant voices floated in from the lane. "Everyone's certain it was Travers," said Mrs. Bantry, helping herself to salad. "And really, Jane, it does look bad. He was quarreling with the poor man, he's evasive about the portrait, and he stormed out of the vicarage in a rage. It fits perfectly." Miss Marple dabbed her lips with her napkin. "Yes, it does fit rather perfectly, doesn't it?" Mrs. Bantry looked at her sharply. "You don't sound convinced." "My dear Dolly, have you never noticed how often in life the obvious answer proves not to be the correct one? People leap to conclusions with astonishing speed. But I find, more often than not, that when everyone is pointing one way, the truth lies in quite another direction." Mrs. Bantry sighed. "You mean you think Travers is innocent?" "I mean only," Miss Marple said gently, "that we must be careful. He may indeed be guilty. But his manner, that bluster, that stiffness, it reminds me very much of poor Mr. Hopkins in St. Mary Mead. He once lost his savings in a foolish investment and pretended all was well, until his pride nearly ruined him. Bluster, you see, can cover many things besides guilt." She smiled faintly. "The trick is to discover what exactly it is covering here." Meanwhile, Colonel Travers sat alone in his drawing-room at Marleycombe House, a decanter of brandy untouched on the sideboard. The portrait haunted him. He had thought it safe to bring into the village, a curiosity at most. But now, with Sims dead and suspicion pressing in, he wondered if he had been terribly wrong. For Colonel Travers had not told the inspector everything. He had not told him what Sims had said in their final exchange. Words that now echoed in his mind with dreadful clarity. "I know whose face should be there, Colonel. And so do you." Miss Marple and the Portrait with No Face. Chapter 7. Miss Marple listens quietly. Morning light spilled across Marleycombe, pale and soft, gilding the roofs of the cottages and shimmering on the hedgerows. The air was heavy with the perfume of late roses, though beneath the sweetness ran a current of unease. People spoke in lowered voices, glancing over their shoulders as though murder itself might be eavesdropping. At the grocer's, two women whispered furiously while weighing sugar. "Inspector says it's Travers. Everyone knows it. Always was a secretive man. Secretive, yes, but not violent. Though his wife, rest her soul, never looked truly happy. Mark my words, he's guilty. They'll clap him in irons before the week is out." And so the words rolled on, like pebbles tumbling endlessly in a stream, polished and reshaped with each telling. Miss Marple, in no particular hurry, was making her way through the high street with her basket. She paused now and then to exchange greetings, to admire Mrs. Lucas's chrysanthemums, or to ask after Mr. Willet's lumbago. Each time she was told a version of the story, each version slightly different. She never corrected, never contradicted. She simply listened, her blue eyes bright and mild behind her spectacles. At the post office, Miss Hartnell was in full flight. "Colonel Travers has been keeping something back, I'm sure of it. Didn't you hear what he said to the inspector? Practically admitted to a quarrel. And men like that, military, you know, all that discipline only hides a dreadful temper." "Indeed," murmured Miss Marple, accepting her change. "Oh yes," Miss Hartnell went on. "My cousin's husband's brother was in the regiment. Absolutely terrifying man when crossed. And Travers looks the same breed. I shall be very surprised if he isn't guilty." Miss Marple thanked her politely and moved on. Later, at the vicarage garden gate, she found young Emily Carter trimming the hedge. Emily's eyes were red from weeping. "Such a dreadful business, Miss Marple," she said, lowering her shears. "And poor Mr. Sims was always so kind. I can't imagine why anyone would harm him." Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on the girl's arm. "You knew him well, then?" "Oh yes. He was always asking about the families here, writing things down in his little notebook. Some thought it nosy, but I didn't mind. He listened to people. I suppose that's what made him so clever." "What sort of things did he write down?" asked Miss Marple, her tone mild, almost casual. "Oh, little things. Who lived where, whose father worked for the estate, who married whom. He said it was all for his research." Emily hesitated, then added, "Though the day before he died he seemed troubled. Asked me if anyone in Marleycombe had connections with the Devon coast. Strange question, don't you think?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, my dear. Quite strange." By late afternoon she had filled her basket with apples, tea, and a neat bundle of gossip. To another eye, it might have seemed idle chatter, nothing but the natural fuss of a small English village. But to Miss Marple, who had lived long enough to know that truth wears many disguises, there were patterns in the noise. For one thing, Colonel Travers was too convenient a villain. Every tongue wagged in his direction, as though the village had agreed upon a culprit before the facts had truly settled. And yet, woven through the chatter, there were curious little inconsistencies. Sims asking about Devon, his peculiar fascination with the portrait, the whisper that Travers's late wife had never seemed content, and above all, the haunting words he had spoken to Travers. "I know whose face should be there." As Miss Marple set her kettle to boil, she reflected, not without a certain satisfaction, that human nature was very much the same in Marleycombe as it was in St. Mary Mead. Pride, vanity, envy, fear, they played out in endless variations. One need only watch carefully, and listen even more carefully, and the truth would, in time, declare itself. She sat back in her armchair with her knitting, her needles clicking softly, her mind turning over all she had heard. And when the church bells rang for evensong, Miss Marple whispered, almost to herself. Colonel Travers may be guilty of many things, but not, I fancy, of murder. Miss Marple and the Portrait with No Face. Chapter 8. Shadows from the Past. The following morning broke gray and unsettled, a veil of mist drifting down from the hills and shrouding Marleycombe in a damp stillness. It was a day, the villagers agreed, that suited their mood. Murder had shaken their quiet world, and though the police still spoke of progress, there was no comfort in it. Inspector Graves called at the vicarage just after breakfast. The vicar, flustered but eager to be of service, ushered him into the study where Miss Marple happened to be taking tea. "Ah, Miss Marple," the inspector greeted, with a small nod. "Perhaps you'll allow me to trespass upon your common sense again. I have a development." Miss Marple smiled serenely. "Common sense, Inspector, is much like a patch of weeds in a garden. It grows everywhere if one knows how to look." The inspector, who was not a man much given to philosophy, frowned but produced a leather folder. "We've traced the portrait." That was enough to stop even the vicar in his tracks. "You mean the painting that so unsettled poor Mr. Sims?" "Exactly," Graves said. He laid down a brittle sheaf of papers. "It belonged once to the Ashworth family, old landowners from Devon. Sold during hard times. Passed through several hands before winding up here in Marleycombe House. And here's the curious part. Records show it originally depicted a lady, Lady Margaret Ashworth. Only, at some point, her face was deliberately painted over. The rest of the figure remained. Dress, jewels, background. But the face obliterated." The vicar gasped. "Good heavens! Why on earth would anyone do such a thing?" Graves gave a humorless shrug. "Shame, scandal, spite. Who can say? But someone didn't want her likeness preserved." Miss Marple's needles clicked faintly as she resumed her knitting. "Human nature," she murmured, "is very seldom content to destroy without reason. If the face was concealed, it was not because it mattered little, but because it mattered too much." By midday, the village was abuzz. News of the painting's origin spread like wildfire, embroidered at every retelling. Some swore Lady Margaret had been a notorious adulteress. Others insisted she had betrayed her family during wartime. Still others whispered of madness, a curse, even witchcraft. At the Green Man Inn, the landlord declared with relish, "Mark me, the lady was struck from the canvas because her spirit walks. No wonder Mr. Sims was afraid." "And perhaps no wonder he was killed," replied a patron grimly. "Some secrets won't stay buried." Miss Marple, sipping her modest half-glass of stout in the corner, listened as she always did, filing away the words. That afternoon, she paid a visit to Colonel Travers. His house stood a little apart from the others, solid stone and ivy-covered. He greeted her stiffly, mustache bristling, but his manner softened when she explained she had brought some blackberry jam. "Always welcome," he muttered, leading her into a dark-paneled sitting room. Miss Marple observed him closely as they spoke. He was tired, his eyes shadowed, his hands restless. Guilt, fear, or something subtler. "Colonel," she said gently, "did you know of the portrait's history?" His gaze flickered. "I knew it was old. Beyond that, nothing." But Mr. Sims seemed to think otherwise. "He told you he knew whose face belonged there." Travers stiffened, gripping the mantel. "Yes. Damn the fellow. He always poked and pried. But I swear, Miss Marple, I never laid a hand on him." "I believe you," she said quietly. He turned, startled. "You do. Human nature, Colonel. Anger leaves a mark, but so does innocence. One learns to tell the difference." For the first time, a crack appeared in his military composure. His voice dropped. "If you truly wish to know, my late wife once hinted that she had a connection to the Ashworths of Devon. A distant relation, perhaps, but she would never speak of it openly. Said it was a chapter best forgotten." Miss Marple's knitting rested in her lap. How curious, and how very sad. When she returned home, dusk was gathering. She lit her lamp, the soft glow casting long shadows against her walls. Sitting by the window, she thought of Lady Margaret Ashworth, her face obliterated by a painter's brush. What had she done, or what had been done to her, that demanded such erasure. Miss Marple knew, as surely as she knew the seasons, that Mr. Sims had stumbled upon more than idle history. He had uncovered something living still, a secret threaded from Devon to Marleycombe. And somewhere among the whispers, the lies, and the painted-over face, there waited a murderer. She bent once more to her knitting, her expression calm, but her eyes glimmered with quiet determination. Miss Marple and the Portrait with No Face. Chapter 9. The Second Shock. Marleycombe had scarcely begun to digest the revelations about the faceless portrait when the second blow fell. It came quietly, almost stealthily, late on a Thursday afternoon, but its effect on the village was like a stone dropped into still water. Mrs. Harper, the postmistress, discovered it first. She had gone into the back room of the post office to fetch a parcel when she noticed that the storeroom window, usually latched, stood ajar. And upon the counter, in plain sight, lay a small wooden box. She swore it had not been there moments before. Inside, wrapped in brown paper, was a scrap of painted canvas, a woman's face, carefully cut from a portrait. Mrs. Harper shrieked so loudly that customers rushed in from the street. By evening the whole village knew. The missing face of Lady Margaret Ashworth had been returned, but not to the painting. Instead, it had been delivered like some ghastly token, without explanation. Inspector Graves arrived in haste, his usually ruddy face pale with strain. He examined the box with care, then questioned Mrs. Harper and her assistant. Neither had seen who left it. "It's a deliberate message," Graves told the vicar grimly. "The killer is mocking us, or warning us." The vicar crossed himself. What wickedness, to toy with death as though it were a parlor game. Miss Marple, standing quietly in the corner of the post office, bent over the fragment. Her eyes lingered on the painted features. A woman in her prime, serene yet proud, with dark hair swept back and eyes that seemed both knowing and sorrowful. The cut around her face was jagged, hurried, but the preservation of the piece itself was oddly careful. "Inspector," she said softly, "this is not the work of someone who despises her. It is the work of someone who cannot forget her." Graves frowned. "What do you mean?" "Hatred destroys entirely," Miss Marple replied. "Love or guilt destroys only in part." That night, Marleycombe was restless. Lamps burned longer than usual. Curtains twitched nervously. At the Green Man, speculation ran unchecked. Some said the portrait was cursed, and anyone who disturbed it would die. Others swore that Lady Margaret's descendants still lived in the village and that the truth would ruin a family if revealed. Colonel Travers drank heavily, muttering darkly into his glass. Mrs. Brightwell insisted the post office must now be haunted. Mr. Pritchard, ever dramatic, warned that one murder is seldom the end of the matter. "Mark my words, there'll be another before long." And in her neat little cottage, Miss Marple sat awake at her desk, reviewing the threads. Mr. Sims dead, after hinting at knowledge of the portrait's secret. The painting itself defaced long ago, the face concealed. Now the missing face returned, as though summoned from the past. It was no mere prank. No ordinary village squabble. This was a game played with dreadful seriousness. The second shock came at dawn. Farmer Rawlings, trudging out to his fields, found the door of his hay barn swinging wide. Inside, scrawled across the bales in black paint, were 3 words: "She still sees." Rawlings bellowed in terror, and by the time Inspector Graves arrived the entire village had gathered to gape. The inspector was furious. Vandalism, hysteria, theatrical nonsense. Whoever is behind this will hang for it. But Miss Marple, standing very still, read the words with a shiver. She still sees. Not quite a threat. More like a declaration. "Inspector," she murmured, "this is not the language of a lunatic. It is the language of remembrance. Someone is telling us that Lady Margaret, faceless though she may be, cannot be silenced." Graves scowled. "And what do you suggest we do, Miss Marple? Consult the dead." She smiled faintly. "Not at all. But the living, Inspector, will always betray themselves, if one listens long enough." That evening, Miss Marple walked home beneath the fading light. The mist was rising again, curling around the hedgerows. Somewhere in the village, she thought, was a person who knew too much, who remembered Lady Margaret, or what she represented, with a passion strong enough to kill. And as the shadows deepened, Miss Marple felt with quiet certainty, the true danger had only just begun. Miss Marple and the Portrait with No Face. Chapter 10. Secrets in the Vicarage. The vicarage of Marleycombe was a handsome Georgian house, its ivy-covered walls lending it a solemn dignity. To most villagers, it was a place of moral guidance and comfort. But to Miss Marple's keen eyes, it was also a place where secrets could hide, and sometimes fester. Reverend Pottle himself was a kindly, slightly fussy man in his 60s, known for his meandering sermons and his fondness for seed cake. His wife, Margaret Pottle, was brisk and practical, forever keeping house and parish affairs in neat order. They had no children, though many said the vicar's young niece, staying with them this season, filled that gap. Her name was Clara Pottle, and she was 23, a pale, nervous creature, with large eyes that darted about as though fearful of being caught out. Miss Marple had observed her several times since the murder, and though Clara tried to seem composed, her hands trembled when she poured the tea, and her smile never quite reached her eyes. It was at the vicarage drawing-room, on the Friday after the barn incident, that a curious little drama unfolded. Mrs. Brightwell had come for tea, determined, as she always was, to know every scrap of gossip. Colonel Travers arrived late, still red-faced from the tavern, claiming that the police were bungling fools, and that he himself could have solved the matter in a day if given proper authority. Miss Marple sat quietly in a corner, her knitting bag beside her, appearing absorbed in a row of dropped stitches. The conversation inevitably turned to the painted words in Farmer Rawlings's barn, "She still sees." "What can it mean?" cried Mrs. Brightwell, eyes glittering with delight at the drama. "Who is she?" "Surely Lady Margaret herself." "Nonsense," barked Colonel Travers. "Superstitious claptrap. Whoever killed Sims is playing games with us, though why they'd waste their time scribbling on hay, I cannot fathom." Clara Pottle, pale as paper, spilled a little tea as she set down the pot. "Perhaps," she murmured, "perhaps it is a message meant for someone in particular." Her words seemed to hang in the air. Mrs. Brightwell's head swiveled toward her like a hawk's. The Colonel frowned. Miss Marple's needles paused for the briefest second. "And what would you know of it, my dear?" Mrs. Brightwell asked sweetly, though her tone had a sting. Clara flushed scarlet. Nothing at all. Only that, well, sometimes people in villages know things they ought not. Things they ought to keep quiet about." The Colonel gave a sharp laugh. "Ha! Secrets, we've all got them, young lady. But murder's another matter." Later, as the guests departed, Miss Marple lingered. She asked politely whether she might step into the study to fetch her umbrella, which she had mislaid. In truth, she had noticed Clara's reaction and wished to observe her in quieter circumstances. She found Clara alone in the study, standing before a small cabinet, her hands pressed flat upon it as though steadying herself. When she turned and saw Miss Marple, she gave a start. "Oh, I thought everyone had gone." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Only myself, my dear. It's a most charming house. I imagine you must feel quite at home here." Clara hesitated, then whispered, "It isn't home. Not really." She looked down at her hands, twisting them together. "Sometimes I feel as though something is watching me, ever since that horrid portrait was mentioned." Miss Marple's eyes were gentle. "Do you know Lady Margaret's story?" Clara's lips parted, then closed again. At last she said, "Only whispers. That she was betrayed. That she died unhappily." She shivered. "It's as though she won't let anyone forget." Miss Marple laid a comforting hand upon the girl's arm. "Ghosts are not always of the dead, my dear. Sometimes they are the memories we dare not speak aloud." That evening, Inspector Graves came by the vicarage to question Reverend Pottle. He was polite but firm, asking after any unusual confessions or troubled parishioners. The Reverend shifted uneasily in his chair. "You know I cannot repeat what is said in confession, Inspector. But I will say this. There are those in Marleycombe whose souls are deeply burdened. The portrait of Lady Margaret has stirred old sins, long hidden. I fear it may not end with Mr. Sims. Graves pressed him, but the Reverend would say no more. Miss Marple, present with her knitting, made no protest. She needed no names. The guilty, she knew, would reveal themselves in time. That night, Miss Marple sat by her window, the vicarage lights still glowing faintly across the green. She thought of Clara's trembling hands, of the Reverend's troubled words, of the faceless portrait whose image haunted them all. Yes, secrets lived in the vicarage. And secrets, Miss Marple knew, had a way of demanding to be uncovered, even if blood must be spilt again before the truth could come to light. Miss Marple and the Portrait with No Face. Chapter 11. The Colonel's Past. If there was one man in Marleycombe who could not resist making himself the center of attention, it was Colonel Travers. His booming voice could be heard from halfway down the high street, and his opinions were given as though they were military orders, to be obeyed at once. Yet behind all his bluster, Miss Marple knew, there was often something he would rather keep hidden. The gossip began, as it so often did, in the snug of the King's Arms. The tavern, with its low beams and smoky hearth, was the gathering place for men of the village. Farmer Rawlings, Mr. Hargreaves the postmaster, and even young Dickie Symes from the garage were huddled round their pints when Travers came in, declaring at once that the police had gone soft and couldn't solve a crossword, let alone a murder. But it was Rawlings who raised an eyebrow and said, "Funny thing though, Colonel, you knew Sims better than most, didn't you?" The room went quiet. Travers's mustache bristled. Knew him? Ha! Barely at all. A jumped-up dealer with no manners. Why do you ask? Hargreaves leaned forward. Only that Sims mentioned your name more than once. Said you'd tried to buy something off him, and that he refused. Travers flushed crimson. Absolute rot. I never. Well, perhaps a trifling matter over a medal or two. Nothing worth remarking. But the others exchanged glances. For in Marleycombe, trifles were seldom trifles. The whispers grew. Mrs. Brightwell, ever the enthusiast, was quick to repeat the tale. By the time it reached Miss Marple's ears, it had become, the Colonel tried to swindle Sims over Lady Margaret's portrait, and when he refused, Travers lost his temper. Miss Marple, as always, said little. But she did remember something. Sims had once been seen carrying a small, flat package wrapped in brown paper. He had boasted, in that careless way of his, that it was worth more than the entire vicarage. And now, that package had never been found. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple met Inspector Graves on the lane near the churchyard. He looked weary, his coat collar turned up against the wind. "Ah, Miss Marple, you've heard the latest, I suppose? Travers had dealings with Sims. Might be our man." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Might he indeed, Inspector? The Colonel has a temper, certainly. But murder is rather more than bluster and bad manners." Graves sighed. "Perhaps. But Sims was blackmailing someone, I'll wager. Men like him always do. If Travers was the victim, well, he has both motive and strength enough." "Blackmail," murmured Miss Marple softly, almost to herself. Yes, that would explain a good many things. That evening, the Colonel himself paid a call at the vicarage. Miss Marple, who happened to be there returning a borrowed book, watched as he paced up and down, mustache quivering, insisting that his honor was being dragged through the mud. "I tell you, Marple, they're making me out a villain. Me who served king and country for 30 years. To suggest I'd stoop to, well, it's beyond endurance." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked gently. "Yes, Colonel. But you must admit, you did quarrel with Mr. Sims." "Quarrel? Ha! A mere misunderstanding. I wanted that medal, a Waterloo piece, very rare. The man asked a price fit for a palace. I refused, of course. That's all." Miss Marple looked up at him with mild blue eyes. "And did you perhaps mention Lady Margaret's portrait?" For a moment, Travers froze. Then he blustered. "Portrait? What portrait? Never heard of it." But his color had risen, and his hands clenched behind his back. Miss Marple returned to her knitting, saying nothing more. For she had learned long ago that silence was often the best net in which to catch a fish. When the Colonel had gone, Reverend Pottle shook his head gravely. "The man is troubled." His pride is greater than his prudence. Yes, said Miss Marple softly. And pride, Reverend, can lead one very far indeed. Sometimes as far as murder. That night, Marleycombe buzzed with rumor. Some swore the colonel had been blackmailed over an affair in India. Others whispered it was gambling debts. A few even claimed Sims had discovered a scandal involving Lady Margaret herself, and Travers had killed to keep it quiet. Miss Marple, sitting by her fire, simply knitted. She knew well enough that in every tangle of gossip lay at least one strand of truth. The difficulty was knowing which one. Miss Marple and the Portrait with No Face. Chapter 12. The Widow's Tale. It was a grey morning in Marleycombe when Miss Marple decided to call on Mrs. Penhaligon. The old widow lived at the far edge of the village, in a weather-beaten cottage where roses still bloomed stubbornly against the stone walls. She was a woman of nearly 80, bent but sharp-eyed, who had outlived her husband, 3 brothers, and most of her friends. If anyone remembered the half-buried stories of Marleycombe's past, it would be she. Mrs. Penhaligon received Miss Marple with delight, ushering her into a parlor that smelled faintly of lavender and dust. The kettle was already singing on the hob, as though she had known a visitor would come. "Dear Miss Marple, sit ye down. I heard tell you've been asking questions. About Mr. Sims, was it? A nasty business, that. But I dare say there's worse beneath the surface, if one digs far enough." Miss Marple folded her hands calmly. "That is very often the case, Mrs. Penhaligon. I wondered. You knew Lady Margaret, did you not?" The widow's eyes gleamed. "Ah, Lady Margaret. Now there's a tale few will speak. Beautiful she was, but proud. And men. Well, men were fools for her. There was the painter for one. Young Mr. Ellison. Came down from London, all fire and fancy, to paint her portrait." "The portrait?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Yes. The one they say is missing now. But what most don't know is that there were 2 portraits. One, the grand one that hung in the manor dining room. The other, smaller, more intimate. He painted it for himself, though he claimed it was merely a study. No face, you see. He never finished it." Miss Marple's needles clicked faintly. "A portrait with no face," she murmured. Mrs. Penhaligon nodded eagerly. "That's the one. It caused a stir, I can tell you. The Colonel near had apoplexy when he heard. Thought it scandalous. And Sir Geoffrey, Lady Margaret's husband, well, he forbade the painter the house. They said the young man left in disgrace. But rumor had it, Lady Margaret gave him something. A token. Some said a locket. Some said the portrait itself." The kettle whistled shrilly, as though punctuating her words. Mrs. Penhaligon poured the tea with trembling hands. "And now Sims turns up dead. Mark me, Miss Marple, he had that painting. Or knew where it was. That's what got him killed." Miss Marple left the cottage deep in thought. A second portrait. A faceless one unfinished, yet precious enough to kill 4. Could this be the package Sims had boasted about? As she walked back through the lanes, she met Mrs. Brightwell, the village's tireless gossip. The woman was flushed with excitement. "They say the Colonel's to be arrested next. Inspector Graves was seen at his house this morning. And did you hear about the widow Penhaligon? She's been telling stories again. About Lady Margaret. Imagine, a second portrait. If that's true, well, it explains everything." "Does it?" Miss Marple asked mildly. "Explanations are often like umbrellas, Mrs. Brightwell. They may cover some things, but they seldom keep one entirely dry." That evening, at the vicarage, the little circle of villagers gathered as they often did. Mrs. Brightwell repeated the tale with all the embellishments her imagination could provide. Reverend Pottle looked scandalized. A faceless portrait? Of Lady Margaret? Surely not. It would be indecent. The Colonel, red-faced and sputtering, declared the whole thing a vile invention from a senile old widow. But Miss Marple simply sipped her tea. Her eyes rested thoughtfully on the fire. For she knew that gossip might be twisted, but it rarely sprang from nothing. Somewhere in Mrs. Penhaligon's tale lay the key to the mystery, and Miss Marple meant to find it. That night, as the church bell tolled 9, She sat in her quiet parlor, knitting beside the ticking clock. Her mind was not on her needles but on the face that had never been painted, and on the dangerous power of secrets that refused to fade, even after decades. Miss Marple and the Portrait with No Face. Chapter 13. The Inspector's Mistake. Inspector Graves was not a man fond of hesitation. A career spent chasing petty thieves and smugglers along the southern coast had left him impatient with what he called village dithering. To his mind, Marleycomb's murder case was already clear enough. Mr. Sims had been blackmailing someone, that much was certain. Who had the money and the temper to silence him? The answer to Graves was obvious: Colonel Redmayne. By noon the next day, the inspector strode up the colonel's drive, flanked by 2 constables. The colonel himself stood waiting on the steps, blustering as usual, but with a flicker of unease in his eyes. "Now look here, Graves," he began loudly. "This is becoming intolerable. Bad enough to have the village gossiping like hens, without Scotland Yard barging in and treating me like a common felon." "I am not from the Yard, Colonel," Graves replied dryly. "But I intend to see this matter properly concluded. If you please, we will speak inside." The servants scurried, ears sharp for any morsel of drama. The colonel ushered them into his study, where Graves laid out his case with brisk efficiency. Sims had been seen leaving the colonel's property the very afternoon before his death. The colonel had quarreled publicly with him 2 weeks earlier in the Red Lion. Sims had recently come into money. Banknotes the police believed were handed over by someone desperate to silence him. And finally, the old story of Lady Margaret's portrait, now resurrected by gossip, gave motive aplenty. The colonel's ruddy face grew blotched with anger. Blackmail. I never gave that rogue a farthing. As for quarrels, who hasn't quarreled with Sims? The man was an irritant, like a wasp in August. Graves pressed on relentlessly. By the time he produced a warrant to search the house, the colonel was near apoplexy. News spread through Marleycombe like wildfire. By evening, half the village was convinced the colonel would hang. Mrs. Brightwell told anyone who would listen that she had always suspected something wicked in him, while the vicar muttered about pride coming before destruction. At the vicarage tea-table, Miss Marple listened quietly to the chatter. Her needles moved serenely, but her mind was not at rest. She had known men like Graves before, energetic, determined, and sometimes disastrously wrong. When the search of the colonel's house yielded a packet of letters tied with faded ribbon, the inspector's triumph seemed complete. They were old love letters written in a youthful hand and signed by Lady Margaret. "This clinches it," Graves declared. The colonel's jealousy, the painter's disgrace, and Sims, he must have stumbled on these letters, tried to bleed the colonel for silence. The colonel struck him down. Case closed. Miss Marple examined one of the letters delicately when Graves, in a moment of arrogance, allowed it to be passed around. The paper was yellowed, the ink faint, but her sharp eyes noticed something peculiar, a tiny watermark, not of the period in which Lady Margaret had lived, but much later. She said nothing. That evening, back in her cottage, Miss Marple set aside her knitting and thought deeply. Inspector Graves was so pleased with his neat package of evidence that he had not considered whether the package was too neat. A quarrel, old gossip, some letters conveniently discovered in a drawer. It had all the appearance of guilt, but none of the substance. For guilt, Miss Marple knew, was rarely so tidy. Human nature was messier. The colonel might be proud and blustering, but she doubted he was a murderer. No, the real killer was still out there, quietly watching as suspicion settled on the wrong shoulders. And if she was right, the murderer would soon grow careless. That night, the village slept under a hush of autumn rain, but Miss Marple sat awake long past midnight, her candle flickering. She was thinking of 2 portraits, one finished, one faceless, and of a packet of letters that told a story just a little too convenient. The inspector had made his move, but it was, Miss Marple felt certain, a mistake. Miss Marple and the Portrait with No Face. Chapter 14. Whispers at the Vicarage. The rain of the previous evening had cleared by morning, leaving Marleycombe glistening under a weak sun. But the brightness did little to lift the mood of the village. The news of Colonel Redmayne's supposed guilt had spread into every kitchen, shop, and parlor. Even the postmistress was heard to remark that justice always finds its way, even if it takes 50 years. At the vicarage, a small gathering had been hastily arranged. Not a formal meeting, but rather a pot of tea shared among those who needed to unburden themselves of worry. Mrs. Brightwell, naturally, was first to arrive, clutching her shawl and her opinions. The vicar's wife welcomed her politely, though with the weary patience of one accustomed to Mrs. Brightwell's dramatic manner. Miss Marple, having been invited as a steadying presence, sat in her usual quiet way by the fire, her knitting needles clicking softly. She allowed the conversation to flow around her like water. "He's guilty, of course he is," Mrs. Brightwell announced with relish, referring to the colonel. "I always said he had the look of Cain about him. And those letters. What more proof could one possibly need?" The vicar coughed into his teacup. "Proof, Mrs. Brightwell, must be weighed carefully. The law requires more than appearance and gossip." Mrs. Brightwell sniffed. "Gossip is often the truest thing in a village, vicar." Miss Marple smiled faintly but said nothing. She was listening as always. It was during this exchange that the faintest of sounds reached her ears, voices drifting in from the adjoining hall, where the vicar's study door had been left slightly ajar. A young curate, recently come to assist in parish duties, was speaking in low tones to someone else. Miss Marple's hearing, still sharp, caught fragments. "If those letters are genuine. But he couldn't have known, unless someone showed him. We mustn't tell Graves." The words pricked her mind like pins. She kept her eyes lowered, feigning concentration on her knitting, while every sense strained toward the murmur. The curate's voice grew more urgent. She said it was hidden in the portrait. That was why he wanted it back. "Don't you see? Without the face, it means nothing." A sudden creak of the floorboards startled the speakers, and the rest was lost. A moment later, the curate emerged into the drawing room, his expression carefully composed. He nodded to the ladies, then excused himself on the pretext of parish business. Miss Marple's needles did not pause, but inwardly her thoughts quickened. A secret hidden in the portrait? A connection between the missing face and Sims's death? And who was this mysterious she the curate had mentioned? When Mrs. Brightwell at last departed, leaving a trail of dire pronouncements in her wake, Miss Marple lingered behind. She asked the vicar's wife in her mildest voice whether the young curate was settling well into village life. "Oh, Mr. Latham," the vicar's wife replied. "He's earnest, certainly. Quite zealous, perhaps too much so. But kind-hearted. He's been spending a good deal of time with Miss Clara Sims lately. Poor girl, you know, quite distraught over her brother's death." "Ah," said Miss Marple softly. "Yes, the poor girl. Grief makes one vulnerable. Sometimes to comfort, sometimes to suspicion." The vicar's wife looked at her curiously, but Miss Marple only smiled and asked for a little more tea. That afternoon, as she walked home along the damp lanes, Miss Marple reflected on what she had overheard. If Clara Sims had confided something about the portrait to Mr. Latham, then the matter was far from simple jealousy and quarrels. There was a hidden layer, quite literally hidden beneath the paint. She thought again of the faceless portrait, its pale blankness haunting the village imagination. What secret could it conceal? Something worth killing for, evidently. Miss Marple's mind returned, as it so often did, to small parallels from her long years in St. Mary Mead. There had been a case of an old sampler once, stitched by a schoolgirl, that carried a hidden message woven into the pattern. No one noticed it until a quarrel over inheritance forced the truth into daylight. People overlooked such things, but never Miss Marple. "Yes," she murmured to herself, "a portrait may hold more than paint and canvas. Much more." That evening, she wrote a short note and sent it with young Tommy, the butcher's boy, to Inspector Graves. "Dear Inspector, I should very much like to call upon you tomorrow to discuss the letters and the portrait. I beg you not to take any hasty action until we have spoken. Yours sincerely, Jane Marple." Folding the note with care, she smiled faintly, for she knew, beyond any doubt, that the case was shifting. The colonel was not the solution, merely a distraction. The true murderer's mask was still firmly in place. But a whisper overheard at the vicarage had begun to tug it loose. Miss Marple and the Portrait with No Face. Chapter 15. The Secret in the Canvas. The following morning dawned bright, with a thin mist rising off the meadows and curling about the hedgerows of Marleycombe. Miss Marple, shawl wrapped neatly about her shoulders, walked with deliberate purpose to the old rectory where Inspector Graves had arranged to meet her. He had received her note and, though not inclined to admit it openly, he had begun to suspect that her quiet observations might prove more useful than the force of official inquiry. The rectory had been temporarily commandeered as a secure place to keep the portrait that had caused so much talk. It leaned now against the paneled wall of the study, covered with a sheet. When Miss Marple entered, Graves lifted the cloth with a certain grim ceremony. "There it is, ma'am," he said heavily. "The portrait of the late Lady Redmayne. Or what remains of it." Miss Marple studied the painting with her calm, clear eyes. The face was, as everyone knew, painted over into a smooth oval of pale cream, devoid of expression. The gown, the hands, the background of a sunlit garden, all were finely rendered. But the absence of a face gave the whole work a strangely haunting air. "Most curious," she murmured. "One cannot help but feel it hides something, like a locked door in an otherwise open house." The inspector gave a skeptical grunt. "Some village gossip claims the original artist removed the face, others that it was destroyed later. I'm more concerned about those letters. They seem genuine enough, and they give Colonel Redmayne a motive." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Do they? Or do they merely give someone the means to make it appear so?" Graves frowned but did not answer. She stepped closer, peering at the canvas with a delicate concentration. "Have you examined the paint layers, Inspector?" He looked surprised. "Paint layers? I'm a policeman, Miss Marple, not an art expert." "Quite so. But sometimes a portrait, like a person, conceals its history beneath the surface. I once knew a young woman who embroidered her true feelings in the lining of her sampler, thinking no one would see. But of course they did, in the end." The inspector shifted uncomfortably. "You're suggesting this canvas itself may hold some evidence?" Miss Marple nodded gently. "Might we not ask Mr. Dacres, the antiquarian from Elmsworth, to bring his lamp and solvents? A careful eye may reveal if something lies beneath this blank oval." Graves rubbed his chin, then finally agreed. "Very well. I'll have Dacres here this afternoon." The antiquarian arrived with a satchel of tools and the quiet excitement of a man granted a mystery. He set the portrait upon an easel, adjusted his magnifying lamp, and began to test the surface with the lightest of touches. Miss Marple watched from her chair, knitting softly, while Graves hovered nearby like an uneasy schoolboy at a science lesson. After half an hour of careful inspection, Dacres straightened. "There is indeed another layer beneath," he announced. "The face has been painted over, deliberately, but not with professional skill. Someone used an inferior paint, which is why the covering has held but dulled oddly." Miss Marple's eyes glinted. "So the original face still lies beneath?" "Yes," Dacres said with quiet triumph. "And more than that. I can see, even with the lamp, faint outlines of letters, not painted but scratched ever so lightly into the background, near the shoulder." Graves' head snapped up. "Letters? As in writing?" "Precisely. A cipher of some kind. Perhaps initials, perhaps more. With careful cleaning we may expose them." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused for just a moment. "How very ingenious," she said softly. "To conceal a message within a portrait, and then to obliterate the identifying features to keep it from being read. Yes, ingenious and desperate." The following hours passed with tense anticipation. Dacres worked carefully, removing a thin layer of cream paint with his solvent-soaked swabs. Gradually, the outline of a woman's face began to emerge. A strong, beautiful face, with eyes that seemed to look beyond the viewer. And beside her shoulder, faint but legible, appeared the initials. C.S. Graves leaned in. C.S. Clara Sims. Miss Marple's expression remained serene. "Not necessarily, Inspector. It could stand for anyone with those initials, though the coincidence is remarkable." But why on earth would Sims's initials be scratched into the portrait of Lady Redmayne? That, Miss Marple said, resuming her knitting, is the very question we must ask. By evening, word of the discovery had already trickled through the village, as word always does. Mrs. Brightwell declared in the grocer's shop that she always knew that Clara Sims had something to do with it, while others whispered of curses, secret love affairs, and ghosts. But Miss Marple, walking home through the twilight, was not thinking of curses. She was thinking of a frightened young woman confiding in a zealous curate, and of a murdered brother who perhaps knew too much. She was thinking, too, of the strange, calm determination it must take to obliterate a face from a painting, and of what one might be willing to kill in order to keep such a secret. The truth was beginning to take shape, as surely as the woman's features re-emerged from beneath the paint. And Miss Marple knew, with the certainty of long experience, that once the face was restored, so too would the identity of the murderer stand revealed. Not yet, perhaps, but soon. Very soon. Miss Marple and the Portrait with No Face. Chapter 16. The Curate's Confession. It was a mild afternoon in Marleycombe, the sort of day when the village seemed to settle into itself, content with the rhythm of hedgerows, bees, and the quiet rustle of the brook. Miss Marple, however, felt none of that peace. She had seen the initials on the portrait, C.S., and their appearance pressed heavily on her mind. There was only one person in the village who could help her untangle the meaning: the earnest young curate, Mr. Latham. She found him, as she expected, in the vicarage garden, bending over the roses with a pair of rusty shears. His thin, angular face brightened when he saw her, though his eyes carried that nervous tension she had noted before. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said with forced cheer. "Come to see the roses? I'm afraid I've not much of a gardener's touch." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Roses grow best under those who do not fuss over them, Mr. Latham. But I did not come to admire the flowers." He straightened, shears still in hand, and she saw the slight tightening of his jaw. "Oh, I came," she said gently, "to ask about Clara Sims. You know, I think, what has been discovered upon the portrait." His face went white. The shears clattered to the ground. "The portrait? Then you've seen it?" "Yes. The initials. C.S. Quite clearly, though faint. And I believe, Mr. Latham, that Miss Sims confided something to you. Something about that very painting." For a moment, the young curate looked as if he might deny everything. But then his shoulders sagged, and he motioned her toward a garden bench. "I ought not to speak," he said in a low voice, "but God forgive me, I cannot keep silent any longer." They sat, and after a long pause he began. "It was one evening, not more than a fortnight before Harold Sims was killed. Clara came to me in great agitation. She was pale, trembling, nothing like her usual spirited self. She said she had stumbled upon a secret tied to the old Redmayne family. At first she was vague, but eventually it came out. She had been visiting Lady Redmayne's widowed cousin, who lives near the coast. And there, in an old chest, she found correspondence and sketches." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Sketches?" "Yes. Preparatory drawings for the portrait of Lady Redmayne. And in those sketches, the likeness was different. The woman's face was not Lady Redmayne's at all. It was Clara's mother." Miss Marple's needles paused mid-click in her lap. Clara's mother? The curate nodded miserably. Apparently, before her marriage, Mrs. Sims had been involved with Colonel Redmayne. There was talk, hushed up of course, of an engagement that never came to fruition. But the artist was commissioned to paint her, and later that same canvas was altered to bear Lady Redmayne's features instead. Or so Clara believed. She said the initials were scratched by the painter himself, perhaps as a sign of protest, or perhaps simply forgotten beneath the later work. Miss Marple's eyes were very clear, very still. "And Harold Sims?" Mr. Latham lowered his head. Clara told him. She should not have, but she was frightened. She said Harold raged, said that if the truth came out, the Redmayne's standing in Marleycombe would be ruined, and perhaps his own life endangered. He swore he would confront someone, but he never told her whom. And then he was found dead. They sat in silence, the curate twisting his hands together. The garden, with its fading roses and the distant sound of bees, seemed suddenly oppressive. Miss Marple spoke softly as though to herself. So the portrait, then, is more than a likeness. It is a concealment, a mask over another woman's face, and over a history that certain people might kill to keep buried. Mr. Latham looked stricken. Miss Marple, do you think Clara is in danger? Yes, said Miss Marple very gently. I do. And that is why you must tell no one what you have told me today. Not yet. The killer still believes their secret safe. But once they suspect the truth is known. She let the words trail off, but the meaning was plain. The curate clasped his hands together. What shall we do? Miss Marple's smile was faint, but there was steel beneath it. We shall do what is always wisest, Mr. Latham. We shall wait, and we shall watch. And when the time comes we shall act, but not before. That evening, as Miss Marple walked back toward her little cottage, she passed groups of villagers murmuring by the green. The gossip was feverish, speculation rampant. Some said the initials proved Clara Sims herself had painted the face away. Others insisted Lady Redmayne had been mad, jealous, even murderous. But Miss Marple knew better. It was never the loudest whispers that contained the truth. It was the quiet tremor in a young curate's voice, the frantic fear in a girl's confession, the desperate hand that had painted over a portrait to erase the face of the past. And as the shadows lengthened over Marleycombe, Miss Marple felt in her bones that the murderer's patience was nearly at an end. Miss Marple and the Portrait with No Face. Chapter 17. The Midnight Visitor. The church clock in Marleycombe had only just struck midnight when Clara Sims awoke with a start. She had been dreaming, something vague about running through the mist with her brother's voice calling after her. But it was not the dream that roused her. It was the sound. A soft tapping. Deliberate. At her window. Clara sat up in bed, her heart thudding painfully against her ribs. The cottage was dark save for the pale moonlight seeping in around the curtains. For a moment she told herself it must be branches brushing against the pane. Yet the cottage wall was bare of trees. The tapping came again. 3 knocks. Slow. Insistent. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Who's there?" she whispered. There was no reply, only the faint creak of the casement as though a hand pressed against it. Then a voice, hushed but urgent. "Clara, let me in." She froze. The voice was not one she could identify. Low, strained, almost hoarse. Not Mr. Latham. Not one of the neighbors. And certainly not Miss Marple. "Go away," she whispered, but the words trembled and fell flat. "Clara, listen to me. You're in danger. They'll find out you told. You must come with me now." Her breath caught in her throat. "They'll find out you told." The words chilled her blood. Someone knew. Someone knew about the sketches, the initials, the portrait. Her hand hovered near the latch, fear battling with reason. To open the window meant to surrender herself to whoever stood outside. Yet to remain meant that danger lurked nearer than she dared imagine. Meanwhile, in her own cottage across the green, Miss Marple sat by the dying embers of her fire, knitting needles laid aside. She had not gone to bed. Her instincts, that delicate web of observation and intuition, had warned her that something was amiss. She found herself watching the faint glow of the Sims cottage window through a crack in her curtains. When the shadow moved against the glass, Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. She rose, took her walking stick in hand, and slipped silently into the night. Back in Clara's bedroom, the voice urged again. "Quickly, before they come." Clara's fingers touched the latch, but at that very moment, there came another sound, a firm, deliberate knock at the cottage door below. She froze. 2 visitors at once? "Clara," called a different voice, steady and familiar. "It's Miss Marple. Do not open your window. Do not move. Come down and let me in." Relief and terror washed over her together. She backed away from the window, hearing a muffled curse from outside, followed by the rustle of hurried footsteps retreating into the night. Clara hurried downstairs, fumbling with the bolt until at last the door swung open. Miss Marple stood there, her face calm but her eyes sharp as steel. "You did quite right, my dear," she said softly. Quite right. Lock it now. Quickly. Clara obeyed, and when the door was fastened again, she turned to the old lady with trembling hands. He was there, outside my window. He said I must come with him. He said they'd find out. Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on her arm. Yes. I heard enough. That was no friend, Clara. That was the murderer. Clara gasped. But who? Miss Marple shook her head. Not yet, child. But I promise you this. They will try again, for secrets such as theirs do not rest easy. And when they do, we must be ready. Later, when Clara had been settled with tea and a blanket, Miss Marple sat quietly by the fire, her thoughts weaving together threads of memory. A portrait painted twice. A face concealed. A man who knew too much and died for it. A girl nearly silenced in the same manner. And now, a midnight caller desperate to erase what remained. Miss Marple folded her hands. The net was drawing tighter, not only around Clara but around the killer. And she, with her gentle patience, would be waiting when the final strand was pulled. Miss Marple and the Portrait with No Face. Chapter 18. Secrets in the Vicarage. Morning came to Marleycombe with deceptive calm. The sun filtered through lace curtains, shopkeepers arranged their wares, and the milk cart rattled along the cobblestones. Yet beneath the surface, an invisible unease lingered like smoke after a fire. Miss Marple, having spent the night at Clara Sim's cottage to reassure the frightened girl, stepped out early with a basket on her arm. To any villager passing, it looked like the most ordinary errand, a call at the vicarage with scones for Reverend Pritchard. But behind her mild blue eyes, her mind ticked steadily onward. The voice at Clara's window still rang in her ears. They'll find out, you told. Whoever had uttered those words had betrayed far more than they intended. It meant Clara had been right to reveal what she had overheard, and it meant the killer knew the net was closing. The vicarage stood proud and ivy-clad, its garden in late summer bloom. Reverend Pritchard himself answered the door, his face lighting up at the sight of Miss Marple. My dear Miss Marple, you are too kind. Come in, come in. Mrs. Pritchard has just put on a pot of tea. Inside, the vicarage smelled of beeswax, roses, and a faint lingering smoke from last night's hearth. Miss Marple, all politeness, allowed herself to be guided into the library where the Reverend did much of his parish record-keeping. The library was lined with heavy oak shelves, stacked with leather-bound parish registers dating back over a century. Dust motes swirled in the shafts of light falling across them. Miss Marple's gaze lingered not on the Bibles or sermons, but on one shelf in particular, where the most recent register sat slightly askew. Forgive me, she said softly, her eyes on the books. I've always had such admiration for the keeping of proper records. One sees so many patterns of life there, don't you think? The Reverend chuckled, clearly pleased. Indeed, indeed. Baptisms, marriages, burials, they are the fabric of the parish, stitched together in neat handwriting. While Mrs. Pritchard busied herself with tea, Miss Marple rose, her fingers brushing the spines as if in idle curiosity. She paused at the newest register and, with the gentlest motion, drew it out. Inside, neat lines of entries recorded the lives of Marleycombe's residents. Yet as she turned the pages, her eyes narrowed. One name appeared in multiple entries, always on the periphery. Edwin Latham. Witness at a marriage. Executor at a burial. Godfather to a child whose parents had long since left the village. Mr. Latham was very involved, wasn't he? She remarked lightly. The vicar shifted, his genial face clouding a little. Yes, well, he made himself indispensable. A generous man, if rather, curious in his affections. He knew more about certain families than perhaps was quite proper. Miss Marple closed the book gently, her fingers resting on the worn leather cover. She did not mention the marginal notes, faint pencil marks beside certain names. Marks that suggested connections, debts, even possible scandals. It was not only portraits Mr. Latham had collected. It was people. Their secrets, their ties, their weaknesses. When the tea arrived, Miss Marple sipped politely, steering the conversation with her characteristic delicacy. I suppose such knowledge could be dangerous in the wrong hands. The Reverend looked startled. Dangerous? Well, yes, I suppose it might. Though I cannot imagine. Oh, but you do not think his death was connected with parish matters? Miss Marple only smiled her vague, sweet smile. One never knows, Reverend. Sin, I'm afraid, does not confine itself neatly to ledgers. Her eyes drifted once more to the register before it was closed and returned to its shelf. That little book was a map of relationships, of hidden obligations stretching through the village. A killer who feared exposure might well seek to silence not just Latham but anyone who held even a fragment of his knowledge. And Clara Sims, poor child, had stumbled upon precisely that. Leaving the vicarage, Miss Marple walked slowly down the lane, the basket swinging lightly from her arm. To the casual eye she was but a kindly old lady returning from tea. Yet her thoughts were keen as blades. There was someone in Marleycombe whose name in that register meant far more than it ought. Someone who had reason to dread the unveiling of old bonds. She recalled the hurried footsteps fleeing Clara's window, the curse hissed in the night. She recalled a certain villager's insistence on helpfulness, their eagerness to appear blameless, their presence at just the right moments. The threads were converging. And soon, she knew, the portrait with no face would gain one at last. Miss Marple and the portrait with no face. Chapter 19. The trap is set. The village hall of Marleycombe was no grand affair. A modest stone building, with timber beams and a faint smell of polish and damp wool, it had hosted countless church fetes, harvest suppers, and choir practices. To most villagers, it was the heart of community life. On this particular evening, however, it was to serve as something rather different, a stage upon which Miss Marple intended the final act to unfold. She had made the suggestion innocently enough, over tea with Mrs. Banbury. Perhaps, she had said, it would be a good thing to have a meeting for everyone, a chance to put minds at rest, to feel once more that we are united as a parish. The idea spread like ivy. By dusk nearly the whole village had gathered under the hall's low rafters, grateful for distraction, eager for reassurance. Police Inspector Graves sat stiffly at the front, clearly puzzled by the summons but willing to humor the old lady who had, on more than one occasion, outthought his men. Clara Sims sat near the back, pale but resolute, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Mrs. Pritchard whispered with her neighbor. The vicar himself beamed benignly over his flock. And Miss Marple, looking small and almost lost in the wooden chair set for her, folded her hands atop her handbag and smiled that vague, grandmotherly smile which always concealed so much. "My dear friends," she began softly, her voice carrying more firmly than one might expect, "we have lived through a most distressing time. A murder in a place like Marleycombe, it shakes one's confidence in the very fabric of village life. And yet, I believe the truth is never quite so far away as it seems." There was a rustle, a shifting of bodies. A cough. Inspector Graves frowned, half rising, but Miss Marple lifted one hand, quiet but commanding. "I have thought a great deal," she continued, "about Mr. Latham and his, shall we say, particular interests. His portraits, yes, but also his other collections. The things he gathered not in frames, but in the minds of others. Secrets, promises, debts." A ripple ran through the hall like wind across tall grass. Several faces stiffened. One or two eyes dropped quickly to the floor. "Now," said Miss Marple, "it might seem to some that such knowledge gave Mr. Latham power. Power to interfere, power to ruin reputations, power perhaps even to destroy lives. But the irony is," and here her voice dropped just a fraction, "it was not Mr. Latham's power that led to his death. It was another's fear. Fear that something long buried might at last come into the light." She let the silence fall, heavy and uneasy. At the back of the hall, Clara shifted. Her eyes darted toward the door as though she half expected the mysterious voice to whisper again. But Miss Marple's calm presence seemed to steady her. "I have no intention," Miss Marple went on gently, "of naming names tonight. That is not for me. What I do wish is to show something curious that I happened to notice." She reached into her handbag and drew out a small object, carefully wrapped in linen, a fragment of canvas, torn from the back of a frame. On it was a faint smudge of paint, hardly more than a line, but distinct. "This," she said, "was hidden behind the fireplace in Mr. Latham's study. The missing piece from the portrait we all call the portrait with no face. Odd, don't you think, that the face was removed at all? For why destroy a likeness, unless one wished to prevent recognition? There was a stir of surprise. People craned their necks. Inspector Graves leaned forward, interest plain on his face. Miss Marple did not hold the scrap aloft for long. She replaced it in the linen, folded it, and placed it neatly on her lap. Then she looked up, her eyes moving slowly across the villagers, resting for the briefest moment on one figure, just long enough. "The truth is very near indeed," she said softly. "The person who destroyed that face is the same who silenced Mr. Latham. They feared what others might see, and they feared what Mr. Latham already knew. And soon they will betray themselves, as those who live by fear always must." A chair scraped sharply against the wooden floor. Heads turned. Someone had risen too abruptly, their face pale, their hand trembling just enough to draw notice. Miss Marple's eyes, kind and unyielding, fixed upon them with quiet certainty. She did not speak again. She did not need to. The trap had been set, and it had sprung. Inspector Graves rose at once, moving forward, his hand brushing his notebook. The murmur in the hall swelled, villagers whispering, staring, shocked. But Miss Marple only sat serenely in her chair, hands folded, gaze steady. The mask had slipped, and the killer, though not yet named aloud, had stepped into the light at last. Miss Marple and the portrait with no face. Chapter 20. The Killer Unmasked. The village hall was suddenly thick with silence. It was the kind of silence that seemed to pulse, broken only by the faint creak of rafters and the nervous shuffle of feet. All eyes were fixed upon the figure who had leapt to their feet, sweat at the brow, hands trembling, lips parted as if to speak but unable to form words. Inspector Graves stepped forward, his voice sharp. "Now then, what's the meaning of this?" But the villagers already felt it, like a chill settling over the room. They saw guilt before it was confessed. They saw fear in every gesture. Miss Marple, however, remained utterly calm. She had not stirred from her chair. Her hands, folded over the wrapped fragment of canvas, were as steady as a church steeple in the still air. When she spoke, it was almost kindly, as though she were coaxing a frightened child. "There is no need for dramatics," she said. "It has gone on quite long enough. Perhaps it is time, at last, to tell the truth." The accused faltered, their eyes darting desperately about the hall. For a moment, it seemed they might deny everything. But Miss Marple's quiet gaze gave them no room to hide. It was not a look of anger, nor of triumph, but of weary compassion, an understanding that what had been done had been born of fear, of weakness, of the terrible weight of secrets. "You see," she continued, addressing not only the trembling figure but the entire assembly, "Mr. Latham's portrait was more than paint upon canvas. He captured things others would rather have left hidden. Sometimes that was a vanity, sometimes an embarrassment, and sometimes it was something darker." Gasps rippled through the room as her words gathered weight. "I knew, when I found the torn fragment, that someone had sought to obliterate a face, to blot it out, to keep it from being recognized. But the smudge of color, that particular shade of green-gray, told me which sitter it must have been. Mr. Latham's little tricks, you see, were quite distinctive." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes fixed upon the accused. "And when you rose just now, when you could not bear the silence a moment longer, you told us all what we needed to know." The hall broke into whispers. Mrs. Pritchard clutched at her neighbor's arm. Clara Sims sat frozen, her face white, her eyes wide in a strange mixture of horror and relief. The accused stammered. "It wasn't, I never, he forced me." Their voice cracked, the words spilling out like stones tumbling down a hillside. "He knew things I could never let out. He would have ruined me, ruined everything." Inspector Graves moved swiftly, his expression grim. "So you admit it, then? That you struck him down?" A sob tore through the hall. Shoulders sagged. The fight was gone. Miss Marple closed her eyes for the briefest moment, then opened them again, her voice soft as falling snow. "It is always fear," she said quietly. "Fear that drives one to such dreadful lengths. But fear cannot keep the truth hidden forever. It will out, just as the dawn follows night. The inspector signaled to his men. The murderer, no longer able to conceal themselves behind village gossip or whispered rumors, was led forward, stumbling, half broken already. The villagers parted, shocked, murmuring amongst themselves as though the very fabric of Marleycombe had been torn. Miss Marple sat still, watching not with satisfaction but with a deep sadness. She had seen such things before, and she knew she would see them again. Evil, after all, does not dwell only in great cities or among strangers. It lurks in the quietest villages, behind the friendliest faces, waiting only for fear or greed to give it life. When at last the hall was emptied, and Inspector Graves returned to offer his gruff thanks, Miss Marple only nodded. "It was not I who unmasked them, Inspector. It was their own conscience. One merely had to give it space to speak." Graves shook his head, half admiring, half bewildered. "I don't know how you do it, ma'am, but I suppose Marleycombe owes you a debt." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh no, Inspector. Marleycombe owes itself the truth. Nothing more." That night, as the lamps dimmed and the village fell into uneasy sleep, a sense of fragile peace returned. But in Miss Marple's quiet lodgings, where she sat knitting by the window, she knew there was yet one last thing to do, to explain it all fully, to lay out every thread so that none might doubt how the tapestry had been woven. The time for the grand explanation, the gathering of all the pieces, was nearly come.